Godrej Archive's 17th annual lecture, and we are at this beautiful Anchorage Hall of the Royal Bombay Yacht Club. We head Godrej Archives to start the evening, please.
More, please. Yeah. So good evening, everyone. After a gap of 3 years, we tried doing the online mode last year. So we are really excited and overwhelmed with the response. So thank you everyone for coming. So because actually we are during the company's centenary celebrations, late Saurabh Godrej, the then chairman of Godrej Group, envisioned archives to be a heritage center offering invaluable archival material for reference and research. Later in 2006, efforts towards promoting a record-keeping culture within the organization and establishing a formal process for collecting corporate memories started. With the motto Restore, Reflect, Reimagine, Godrej Archives today helps the organization with collection, storage, and conservation of its historically important records, and that includes the current ones as well, using the state-of-the-art standards and practices. With total collection of around 2 lakh items, including more than 300 oral history interviews with not just the former employees but designers, associates, leaders and customers, etc., Godrej Archives today offers a valuable resource of business knowledge for academicians and historians. With an aim to generate awareness about the organization's history and the preservation of India's corporate heritage, Godrej Archives has started many initiatives, and one among them is this annual lecture. We also have a scholar in residence program now to engage with the scholars and actually encourage them to use the archival information that we have and actually produce a lot of work that we really need in India on business history. Through our publications such as With Great Truth and Regards, The Story of the Typewriters in India, published in 2016, and the more recent one is From the Frugal to the Ornate, a story of seating in India. We also try to actually look at the Indian history through the lens of an object. So it's not just the business, but it is products, it's people, which we are trying to research at the Godrej Archives. Godrej Archives also engages with its audience regularly through exhibitions, lectures, workshops, etc. Godrej Archives' annual lecture series is one such pioneering initiative of the archives that aims at popularizing business history and encouraging the conversations on not just business history but also business archives. I would now request Dr. Firoza Godrej, Chairperson, Godrej Archives Council, to say a few words about the lecture series and introduce the speaker. Before that, I would request Dr. Firoza Godrej to welcome our speaker, Dr. Susie Park. Over to you, Dr.
So let me add my own welcome to Dr. Susie Park, who had a lovely conversation with her for about an hour, a free-flowing conversation about personal likes, what we've done as we grew up, and what she continues to do. So it's been a pleasure to have you here amongst us, and I welcome you on behalf of the audience here today. We are several members of our family here. Mrs. Smita Krishna, Mr. Nathan Godrej. We're very happy that you could make the time in your academic schedule to be with us here today. And I just love the title. This is business, and it is personal. And I think the personal part is quite intriguing to most of us, at least to me. As Vrinda mentioned, this is the 17th Godrej Archive annual lecture, and it's a good feeling to be back in person. We adapted very well to Zoom and other platforms and did carry on our work wherever we may have been and whatever discipline we were engaged in. And I think it was the best way forward to remain interconnected during very, very trying times. This journey that we've been on with Godrej Archives has really been rewarding in many aspects. And in the year 2006, when Godrej Archives started the annual lecture series to spark off conversations on business history and the need for business archives, we were skeptical if business history would have an audience. But the wonderful audience, as we have today, have kept us going every year, and it is with your support and encouragement that we could reach for more and be here. We were also very fortunate to have been nominated as a country, India, to host an international business conference where we had archivists from all over the world attending a 3-day congress in factory premises at Vikhroli. And I could see the enthusiasm from the various backgrounds that these people came out, whether it was the Rothschild archives or the Levi archives or a Japanese archives. And there were archivists from China as well. We had a lot to learn from them, but language and other restraints were there. So I'm looking forward for this Congress to be taken to Beijing or some part of China, because it will open up a completely different field of archiving and business archiving for archivists. Of course, needless to say, we've had many distinguished scholars from within India and outside India. It's nice to see what people are doing in the spheres of banking or family archives within our country, because the documentation process has been, I wouldn't say bad, but it's been weak, and we need to strengthen that, and we need to help our colleagues and stretch out to them that we are ready to share our learning experience, have them over in our archives, whether it's just look at conservation, paper conservation, documentation, how to demarcate a business archive from a personal archive. And I'm happy to say it's a good fraternity that we have established through Godrej Archives. This year, we're really fortunate to have Dr. Susie Park, an associate professor in the Department of History at St. John's University, New York, and a graduate of Dartmouth College and Cornell University. She is the author of The Gentleman Bankers, am I correct? Yes. The World of J.P. Morgan, it was published by Harvard University Press in 2013. Dr. Park serves as co-chair of the Columbia University Economic History Seminar and as co-editor of the Global Enterprise Series of Cambridge University Press. She's a member of the editorial advisory boards of the Business History Review, Financial History, the Management of the Museum of American Finance, and Connections, the journal, that's the Journal of the International Network of Social Network Analysis. She also serves as a contributing editor for Gotham and a blog for scholars of New York City history. That's quite a tough one because it's a port of entry for immigrants. And from Southeast Asia, we have a number of people who have sought their fortunes across their own shores in the US. She served as a trustee of the Business History Conference. I now request Dr. Susie Park to divulge, giving you an intriguing word, divulge, through the process of excavating and analyzing the archival sources of American banker J.P. Morgan, to show how the deeply personal nature of private banking can be found in the ephemera left to history. Thank you, Dr. Park, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Dr. Feruza Godrej, the Godrej family, Verinda Fathare, and the Godrej Archives for having me and here inviting me to give the 17th annual lecture. I'd also like to thank Shriya Sawant, Amrita Marate, the Godrej staff, and also the staff of the Royal Bombay Yacht Club for their assistance in organizing the logistics for this lecture and coming to Mumbai. It is a real great honor to be here, and I'm particularly honored because historians really rely on archives and the stewardship of archivists to do the work that we do. While working on my recent project, it occurred to me that historians do not always tell archivists how important they are for safeguarding the records that we need for posterity, for having a commitment to the ethics of their profession, and for sharing their knowledge of their collections while we're in their spaces. All of this affects the ways in which our research unfolds. So given the archival setting, I thought that it would be appropriate for me to tell a story about that process today, the collaborative process of historical research and archival discovery, by talking about the American banking families who are the subject of my book, Gentlemen Bankers, The World of J.P. Morgan, and which laid the groundwork for my current project on the changing makeup of Wall Street after the Second World War. The title of my talk is a tape saying that was made popular by a Hollywood film. And in the film, the main character says, "This is business, it's not personal." And it's tongue-in-cheek because its meaning in the film is exactly the opposite of what Michael Corleone claimed to say. If the statements of these fictional characters in The Godfather have resonated in the world of business, it's because the lived experience of business people consistently defy attempts to view economics as a field populated by rational actors. The story of Gentlemen Bankers, which is the story of private investment banking, is one that highlights this personal nature of business, though in and of itself this is not a new topic nor a controversial one. The contribution of the book to the literature, I would say, is that it also asks us to think about what it means when social relations are absent, or when personal animosity is present in a business where relationships are the foundation for the formation of trust. The book is especially interested in the barriers that stem, barriers to trust that stem from ethno-religious prejudice. And it argues that in the face of these barriers, private bankers were able to create trust, not because the desire for profit and money made them put these prejudices aside, which is the standard explanation, but that it was possible because of the way in which the world of finance was embedded in the gendered and racialized institutions of American society. As I will demonstrate, this is an embeddedness that was so fundamental it could hide in plain sight, and it took careful archival and historical excavation to make it fall. Gentlemen Bankers did not begin actually as a study of the personal nature of business. It began as a study of American empire in Asia. Before the Second World War, the American government's commitment to the liberal ideas of limited state power constrained its quest to promote free enterprise and expand American interests abroad. So its solution was to leverage the interests of America's private capitalists in order to compete with the imperial interests of the European nation states. This alliance between American private capital and American government was called dollar diplomacy. In 1909, J.P. Morgan and Company became the leading bank of the American group of the International Banking Consortium to China, or the IBC, whose ostensible purpose was to lend private money to China for the development of its national infrastructure, especially its railways. This was a purpose that it ultimately did not succeed in achieving, if it was ever its real purpose to begin with. There was one other American private bank in the original IBC agreement, and that was Kuhn Loeb and Company. In the late 19th century, and until the First World War, Kuhn Loeb and Company was the Morgan's strongest competitor. Today, Kuhn Loeb's name has largely been forgotten by the general public, but at the time, it far outranked other private banks with 19th century pedigree, such as Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers, with whom Kuhn Loeb eventually merged. Founded in 1867, Kuhn Loeb grew rapidly under the leadership of Jacob Schiff, who's shown here, a German-Jewish immigrant who joined the firm the year he married the daughter of one of the founding partners. Kuhn Loeb's position in the IBC reflected its elite status as Japan's foreign bankers, a status that they earned by underwriting the Japanese war effort in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. Schiff had an intense animosity against the Russian Tsar because the Tsar's pogroms against Jews. So when the Japanese government sent Finance Commissioner Godrej to London to raise money for the war effort, the two joined forces. After Japan won the war against Russia in 1905, Schiff received a personal commendation from the Japanese emperor, and Takahashi's daughter Wakiko actually went to New York for 2 years to live with Schiff and his wife on the Upper East Side. Though the Morgans and the Schiffs worked together in the field of international finance, and both were committed to the expansion of Japanese empire in China, and though they had many common interests and values as private bankers, they were not friends. Their relationship contrasted with the Morgans' ties with bankers with whom they did a lot of business. When the Morgans corresponded with people with whom they were also close friends, there's a qualitative difference in the language that they use, which is evident in the letters that they wrote, such as those that are housed in the Pierpont Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. And in these letters, they talk about trust, they talk about love. They use the word love often. This is one of my interesting findings. So consider this cable from Myron Taylor, an industrialist, to the Morgan partners about the death of George Baker, who was the head of the First National Bank of New York. Myron Taylor, let us join together in our great sorrow, stop. I loved George greatly, as did you, stop. I shall return for final obsequies, much love, Myron. This is a very typical cable that you might read in the archive. Here's another one from Junius Morgan, who is Pierpont Morgan's grandson, and Jack Morgan, his father, who is Pierpont Morgan's heir and son. Note the use of the pet names for partners, like Bunny. Bunny refers to partner Bernard Carter. From your reply to our cable last Wednesday, we feel sure you will agree with the firm policy we have adopted not to comment publicly in any way on the results of the election. You can see that it's 1936, FDR election, for the present. All partners here, including Dean and Bunny, join me in bon voyage and love. The archives are full of these kinds of sentiments that intertwine business with personal, emotional care. And this was one of the things that I noticed as I was reading through their papers for several years. The same kind of care and concern are also reflected in the correspondence of Kuhn Loeb and Company between the partners and their friends, which are housed in the American Jewish Archives at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. But significantly, the correspondence between the Morgans and Kuhn Loeb, when you find it, is not evidence of close personal or sentimental relationship. This is not just because they were great competitors, but because of anti-Semitism. Jewish and Yankee bankers did not have overlapping social networks because starting in the late 19th century, Anglo-American Protestant social elites and institutions discriminated against persons of Jewish background. In general, the Morgans ignored Jews socially, as they did racialized minorities. So because they're ignoring them, it's not always obvious what they felt because they're just not there. But the picture of their anti-Semitic feelings did actually emerge in their personal papers as well. And case in point was that they were mainly expressed when they were forced to be in the same spaces as Jews when they couldn't be avoided. And one key example is on transatlantic crossings, on ships. So many of these mentions of Jews really only happen, for example, on ship stationery. So there's a way in which the material culture of the archive shared something about the sentiment that was being expressed. This is an example from 1924 from Jack Morgan to his mother. This is just a line to let you know that we are all right and having a really delightful voyage with no Jews and no one on board traveling with anyone else's wife. There's no, and there was an underline. There's another letter I could have shown you that said there's no Jews and no actresses. They're very unhappy about actresses. Now, the issue of anti-Semitism created obvious problems for a personal business like private banking, where one's self-respect and identity were essential to one's reputation. If the Morgan partners had ever directly expressed anti-Semitic views to the Kruenloh partners, it would have made it impossible for them to do business. Schiff, for example, would not do business with the Reading Railroad because of the public anti-Semitism of its president. He wrote London banker Ernest Cassell, quote, "Our self-respect forbids us to have anything to do with this man, able as he may be." Now, given the nature of upper-class culture, the Morgan partners were not likely to be publicly anti-Semitic because the open expression of such views was considered untoward. But the absence of prejudice is not enough to create a foundation for trust. So the central question of the book, which I was telling Dr. Godrej, the book did not start off this way at all. Emerged from a recognition of these seemingly irreconcilable differences. And it was like a question that kept coming up and up. And those tend to be the ones that tell you this is what the book is about. And the question was this: in a business like private investment banking, where personal relations are so important, how did Anglo-American and German Jewish American bankers before the Second World War create trust and work together given the context of anti-Semitism? Now, historians have argued that even though the Morgans and the Schiffs were not friends, they respected each other and they worked together. Others have implied that anti-Semitism did not matter because it was only business, or it was about the money. But there are a couple of issues with this idea. One is that the Morgans and Kruenloh themselves stated in their words, both publicly and privately, that money was not their motivating factor. In fact, my first chapter starts on this, where Morgan is giving testimony at the Pujo Money Trust hearings in Congress in 1912, and they ask him what is the most important thing in business, and they say, Untomar, who's the prosecutor, says, is it money? And Morgan says, no, it's honor. Right? It's character. And they don't believe him. I think we should take our historical subjects seriously. That's the first thing. Right? The second thing is that, and this is an empirical issue, and this is where the archives come into it, is that no one had actually tested how much work they actually did do together. Now, one of the things that you'll notice about my style as a historian is that I don't like to assume. I prefer to know what the sources say. And so one question the gentleman bankers thus had to ask and answer was, how much work did Kruenloh actually do with the Morgans? If, for example, we had discovered that they had not worked together, as had been previously assumed, then there would be no reason to go further, because we would just conclude that they were socially and economically separate, and then that would be it. But we had to be able to test this theory. How could I test this theory? So the Morgans had 12 syndicate books, which were very large letters that listed every deal the Morgans took part in between 1894 and 1934. And there's also a series of books from the Drexel Morgan and Company papers, which was an earlier company that J.P. Morgan was a principal of. The purpose of a syndicate, which was first utilized in the United States in the early 19th century, was to spread the risk of underwriting very large capital projects. Unlike corporations where one risks only one's own investment, all the partners in a private partnership have personal unlimited liability. So they use syndicates as a way to manage that risk. Now, when one was asked to participate in a Morgan syndicate, it indicated that one had to be trusted enough, close enough, or important enough to be included, because syndicates were highly vetted. It was a privilege to be included. And the Morgans to dole out these privileges because in private banking, once a bank had an established relationship with a client, it was understood that that relationship would be respected and no action by any other bank would take place with that client without the original bank's explicit permission. This understanding was the central principle of gentleman banking. Gentleman banking is fundamentally a reference to an agreement to limit competition. Now, I was first made aware of the syndicate books by Maria Molestina, who's one of the archivists at the Pierpont Morgan Library, which is housed, as you saw in the photograph, in Pierpont and Jack Morgan's original homes on Madison Avenue between 36th and 37th Street in New York City. She mentioned it very casually to me as something I might be interested in looking at, and I remember saying, let's call it up and take a look. Lots of times research is just about being very open to the process of discovery, and this is an example where it clearly paid off because the books turned out to be a major turning point. Because when I saw them, I realized that the books were like a friendship network, a picture of the Morgan's economic network of collaborators. In the books, each Morgan deal details the client, the deal, most do the profits and losses, and all the syndicate partners in the order in which they were given participations in the deal, usually with the largest at top. So the way that now these books are very large, and I'm not tall, so I had to stand to see them. When you open them up, they're about this fat, and they're about this big. The left side always lists the top, the name of the deal, and then details of the deal. Then in the middle, they would have stuffed the syndicate agreement, it's usually typewritten. This is the syndicate agreement for the U.S. Steel Corporation, which was the first billion-dollar corporation. And then on the right-hand side, and it's all written in pencil, so you can imagine it's a lot of fun to read. And lists all the syndicate participants with the people who got the most participation at the top, and then it goes down. And there were over 1,000 in this deal, because it was huge. This is another example of the JIK Threshing Machine Company deal. You can see that JP Morgan was the only syndicate manager. And the reason why I'm showing this to you is because it's just a little easier to see. It will list the original purchasers, right? So you can see they got it at 92. And then they resell it to the syndicate for just a little bit more, making money off the spread, right? And then it was expected to be. And in fact, all of the partners also had, starting from Charles Steele, their own participations as well. The profits could also be listed, and then the profits at every stage of the deal, right? In purchasing, in syndicate, in distribution. Now, knowing the amount of business a participant did could also tell you how important a participant was to the Morgans over a long period of time. Thus, I realized that the books could be used to answer the question about whether or not the Morgans did do business with Jewish bankers like Kuhn-Loeb relative to any bank. So basically, any time you showed up in a deal here, what I did is I created an Excel file that was put in alphabetical order with your name. And then every time you were given participation in a deal, I wrote down the deal's name, the amount you were given, and then the year. And then all of this was aggregated into this giant, what I call master Excel file. Because the problem was the syndicate books, as themselves, do not tell us what we need to know. Right? This is part of the historical interpretation. So over a period of about 2.5 years, I translated every deal in those books into an Excel file and coded them according to the type, the client, and so on. And from this analysis, I was able to get a sense of the Morgans network, whom they work with, whom their clients were, whom they stopped working with, how their relationships changed over time. And so this, and I also broke it up into every 5-year period. So I was able to see, maybe you only did business with the Morgans before the First World War, and then it just stopped. Why? Right? This is one of the things that I found for Speyer and Company. At a certain point, they just drop off. And then I had to go back to the qualitative sources, actually in Guildhall, to find out that they had a disagreement about a deal on Argentina that they felt that the Speyers had poached them on, and that's why they just love it. But the research on the back end is the basis for my confidence in saying that I know who the Morgans work with, how much, and for which client. And as you can see Kuhn-Loeb is number 3. I confirmed that in fact they did do work with German Jewish banks, specifically Kuhn-Loeb, in specific amounts, the deals that the Morgans had done. These findings meant that I could move forward with my question, because again, if I had found out that they had done none or little work, or if the deals that they had done with Kuhn-Loeb, their profit was so much greater, then we could have been persuaded by the money argument. But that's not what we found. Right? So we continue with the inquiry. But then I had to think about social networks. I had the qualitative evidence that anti-Semitism exists, but how did I know it was not just the prejudice of individual partners? How did we know that it was structural to the Morgan firm, to their business as an organization? Now first, in order to answer that question, I had to determine how could I measure the Morgan social networks. If the syndicate books were an appropriate proxy for their economic networks, what would be the equivalent source for their social networks? A clue came from their obituaries, and the suggestion of obituaries had originally been suggested to me as an important source for biographical data by one of the librarians at Baker Library at Harvard Business School, Tim Mahoney. Again, it was something that he as a librarian mentioned to me very casually. I can literally picture him standing behind a desk saying the word obituary. I don't even know if he realizes even to this day how significant this was. But when I began to study them, all the obituaries for all the partners from multiple banks for a period of about half a century, I began to notice that obituaries had a common structure. And one of them, which is so interesting, is that they all ended with a list of their clubs. So this is the case before. After 1965, they stopped listing clubs, which is also very significant, right? But before then, it's almost universal. It was a private members club, just like the Royal Bombay Yacht Club, where we are today. Elite private clubs developed in New York City in the mid-19th century and became very much part of the urban landscape. Clubs were private, but they were not secret, and their activities were reported, such as the Social Register, which was listed in the Social Register, were referred to as members, and one had to be recommended by a member to be listed. This is a process that mimicked club admissions. We could even think of the Social Register as a club. You could think of it also as a historical Facebook for elites. Right? Now, of all the Morgan partners between 1895 and 1940, that's 41 men, 93% or 39 partners were listed in the Social Register, New York or Philadelphia, because there was also a Philadelphia branch called Drexel and Company, 2 years after they became a partner. The only partners who are not listed in the Social Register were those who became partners in 1939, and 2 of them were Canadian. This and another study I conducted with my colleague Dan Haljan of the University of Kentucky, where we correlated the Morgan partners' percentage capital in the firm to their social clubs, which is something that we detail in another paper, indicated that social clubs were important to the firm as an economic organization, that the partners would move up in the firm correlated to the number of clubs that they had in common with other partners, specifically elite clubs. But then I ran into another problem. Well, let me just explain a little bit about what the Social Register looks like. So the Social Register always has the acronyms for the clubs here on the left-hand side. And then HathiTrust.org actually digitized many of them, not before my project, unfortunately. So I had to go from library to library to library. Philadelphia Historical Society, the New York Society Library, the New York Public Library, New York Columbia's Butler Library, because no one has one complete set of all the social registers for all the cities. The Library of Congress, it took a lot of legwork. But then they digitized them, and this is basically what it looks like. So you can see J.P. Morgan on the bottom, and then Francis L. Tracy was his wife. It always lists the wife's maiden name. And then it has a list of the clubs, which I believe is in the order of their seniority, or how difficult they were to get into, or prestige. So you have the Union, University, Knickerbocker, Brook, Union League, Metropolitan, Century, New York Yacht, Sewanaka Yacht, New York. So MTW is Metropolitan, Washington. EYB is Eastern Yacht, Boston. And then CD are his wife's clubs, Colonial Dames and CLY is Colony. And you can see his daughter, Ann Morgan, who was never married, lived in the same household at this time. She also has her own clubs as well. Now on the right-hand side, this will become important later, you can see there is the phone number, the address, and also it tells you when they're in town. So you can say Mr. arrived on the Olympic is probably a name similar to that, August 15th, Mrs. aboard the same ship, September 19th. So they were only together for about 3 weeks, right? This also tells you a little bit about their relationship. And imagine having this kind of information. It was really like a visiting list, right, for elite people today, right? The CEOs of banks today. It's kind of unthinkable. Right? It's a remarkable source. The problem is that the social register doesn't tell you how much time the partners actually spent at the club. Is it just a title that makes you look good, or a club's used? Were they actually part of your daily life? To answer this question, I turned to another source that Maria Molestina introduced me to, and those were easily analyzed. They had to be translated in a coded Excel file to analyze the place, date, content of his events, to study Morgan's activities related to social clubs, relative to things like boards of directors minutes, or sitting on the boards of charity organizations or art organizations. So this is an example of a date book from 1907. I had been looking at this because there's a very big panic that happens in 1907. And I wanted to see if there was any mention of it. There is not, partly because I believe Morgan himself did not write in this date book. And we know that because of the handwriting, and we also know that because they refer to him as Mr. M in the book. This is always the first page of all the date books. It lists payments that were given. On the bottom, I don't know if you can see, but you will see that Miss Ann Morgan every year was given $5,000. Now the average pay of an industrial worker working 80 hours a week in this year was $400 a year. So that gives you an idea of how much money she was given by her father every year. So the events were listed right on Wednesday, January 2nd at 7:45 p.m. He had dined with Mr. French, which was a friend of his, also a businessman. Sometimes it also lists the place. So what I did is I translated this into an Excel file. This actually took me only about a month, but it listed the date, what it was for, the time, the place, and then I coded it. Was it a club? Was it a private residence? Was it for a board? And so on. One of the things that I found is about 10% of the 1,955 events listed in the date books directly involved club business or club activities, which was not insignificant. The problem was, even if we know that the events were important enough to be listed in the Morgan date books, we don't actually know if he attended, right? Sometimes they were crossed out, but not for every single one. If you looked at my date book 100 years from now, you would know if I went. Because if I go, I cross it out. If I didn't go, I do a double X. There was no such pattern in the Morgan date books. And in the Morgan date books, they mentioned that Mr. M had a small book. Most likely, if we could find that small book, we have a really good idea of what he did, right? Who he saw and so on. Now, it is unlikely that an event would be listed without his approval. But did he actually go? Again, we couldn't assume. But how could I test? I needed independent verification. Now here I benefited from the insights of my fellow Morgan reading room researchers, what I would call the community of the archive. During this time, a CUNY graduate student at Abraham Schiff, in no relation to the cum laude Schiffs, was at the Morgan conducting research on a Hamlet manuscript. The Morgan Library holds many significant manuscripts, unrelated to the business papers. From Schiff, I learned that the records of the New York Central Railroad, which was an important railroad, and Pierpont Morgan sat on the board, and you could see him sitting on, listing the board meetings for not only the railroad, but also the subsidiary lines, were housed at the Manuscripts and Archives Division of the New York Public Library, which is only about a 10-minute walk from the Morgans. Bless you. It's located on 40th Street and 5th Avenue. So I went and I visited the New York Public Library, where I discovered the New York Central Boards of Directors meetings included a list of attendees, so it had a roll call. And so you can see all of the lines that make up the New York Penn Central. And what I did is I went through and found all of the meetings and checked the date to see that were in the Morgan date books to see if they matched with the boards of directors minutes to show that JP Morgan was actually there or not there. And when I hit upon that strategy, I repeated the same exercise for the New Haven Railroad. You can see I had to figure out what they had and what they didn't have and what book and what box they were in. For the New Haven Railroad, which is another important railroad to the Morgan Bank, that are housed at the University of Connecticut's Thomas J. Dodd Research Center. And then I also did a similar cross-checking for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, on whose board Pierre Von Morgan also sat, who was a great art collector, with the assistance of archivist Jim Mosk, who could not give me access to the Board of Trustee records myself, but was very kind enough to check them for me. So I sent him a list of all the meetings, and he wrote me back, and he said yes, no, yes, no, yes, 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 and so on. Now, as I state in Gentlemen Bankers, the cross-checking verified Morgan's presence or absence for 43% of the events listed in the date books. Right? So that's all the ones that we could find for New York Central, New Haven, Metropolitan, and so on. Of those events, I was able to verify, actually written in another source, that JP Morgan attended approximately 64%. So though the date books are incomplete, and though we are only checking 43%, I argue that they were, to the best of our ability, a reliable source of Morgan's activities, and thus that they indicated social clubs were an important part of his social world. Now, many of Morgan's business colleagues were also members of the same social clubs. In the text, I repeated this process. I looked at the social register status of 7 of Morgan's bank collaborators, all their partners and their executives, including commercial banks, over a period of 40 years. This was several hundred men. When we look at the social world of the Jewish bankers, they stood out in comparison to the non-Jewish houses because only a small minority of the partners were listed in the social register. 2 Kunlun partners were listed, Mortimer Schiff and Otto Kahn, but they were not members of the most elite private men's clubs, with the exception of the New York Yacht Club. Jacob Schiff was never listed in the social register. This one difference, which is only apparent when we study both the social and the economic networks of the bankers, forces us to consider that the structure of the banking community was much more complicated than only their economic ties, such as their syndicated cooperation would suggest. Thus, the archival and historical data indicate that before the First World War, Morgan and Kunlo partners did not patronize the same social, religious, cultural clubs or associations, not just as individuals, but as firms, as organizations. I felt very comfortable in being able to state that in the book because I went one step further to show that there was a social separation by utilizing historical geography, which turned out to be a fateful research decision for other reasons. Now, where one lives in New York City is a strong statement of one's identity and social status. I would not be surprised if you could say that about any city. But on the island of Manhattan, which is so densely populated, the distance and location can be as small as just a few blocks apart, but represent worlds apart. My goal was to map the addresses of the Morgan and Kunlo partners to test the theory that their geographic references reflected their social distance. And this was an idea that I got from the social register, which listed a member's home address. And for the as you saw, for the Kunlo partners, because they were not listed, I had to find their home addresses from U.S. Census listings or from personal papers. Now, the idea seemed good, but the practical issue of mapping historical addresses was daunting, because addresses change over time. New York City has been built and rebuilt. Some buildings have stayed the same, like Jack Morgan's house here, which you see on the left, right? But again, we can't assume that they would change, and they probably do change. This is Jacob Schiff's house in 1905. This is what it's like now in 2003. Now, early 20th century maps from sources like atlases, almanacs, or business directories do not always have house numbers, and those that do only show small sections of the city. So this is an example where you do have a pretty good map of Manhattan, but it's not going to give you house level data, and I needed house level data, right? I needed one big atlas for all of Manhattan, where all the houses were geocoded to the present day. How was I going to find that? Now, to make a very long story short, over a period of about a year, this is another example, I should say. So this is an example of house level data mapping for the Sanborn Fire Insurance Map Company. And you can see why it's so detailed, because they were done for fire insurance purposes. This book is huge. That's me in the New York Public Library's map room. It was so big, in order for me to take a photograph of it, I had to stand on a stool. All right, so you can see how tall it is. But this is the level of detail I needed. But I needed that for the entire city, and I needed it geocoded. Now, as luck would have it, to make a very long story short, over a period of about a year, and then with the critical assistance of a company called Environmental Data Research, which owns the copyright to the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps, I was able to identify the actual house location of the private homes and offices of the Morgans, Croom Loeb, and other banking syndicate partners at the latitude and longitude level. And I was able to do this because EDR digitized and geocoded the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps, which is a process they actually had done here in India. And it took about 2 years. So thanks to the late John Walker, who was the EDR vice president, and Hank Chin, who was an engineer at EDR, I was given access to the EDR maps, and armed with a list of these historic addresses and dates that I had gathered from the register, from the atlases, from census data, I was able to map hundreds of historic addresses on a geocoded map of New York City using ArcGIS, the Geographic Information System software, with data that was provided by the New York City Planning Office. Today, you could do the same thing with data from the New York Public Library and Google Map Pro for free. And unfortunately, because this is a PDF, we had a PowerPoint version where I actually made a video to kind of show you how to do it. I'll see if during the question and answer period we can get that back. Because you can actually do it yourself now for free using Google Map Pro, because the library has actually geocoded those small Sanborn Fire Insurance map, and then they just drop right into where they would be on an everyday map. And then you can drop pins and find the latitude and longitude of a house. So this is an example that just gets uploaded to ArcGIS, and within 2 seconds it will visualize this map for you. So in the early 1900s and until the First World War, most of the New York Morgan partners lived close together in a neighborhood called Murray Hill, which is between Lexington and Madison Avenue, between 33rd and 39th Streets. It's an older, fashionable neighborhood. They not only lived relatively in close geographic proximity to each other, they also congregated around Pierpont Morgan's home at 219 Madison Avenue, where Morgan had lived since 1881. Now, by the time J.P. Morgan and Company was reorganized in 1895, Jacob Schiff and his partners lived relatively far uptown, some 40 blocks away from the Morgan clique. Now, as you can see, the geographic locations of the bankers' home addresses also have a story to tell about the social distance between the two groups, verifying, I argue, that the absence of Jewish bankers in the social register, what that absence had already suggested, which is that in this key area, that of social networks, merchant banking networks did not overlap. Now at this point, I want to return to the original question of the book, because it's easy to lose sight of it in all the details of research, because there's so much to do to check off the list in historical verification and testing. The question was, in a business like private investment banking, where personal relations are so important, how did Anglo-American and German Jewish bankers before the Second World War create trust and work together in the context of social anti-Semitism? If it wasn't money, then what made it possible? Now, this is when things start to get really interesting, and how it should be obvious to us. If we were to look at where the Morgan partners work downtown, as well as where their syndicate partners work, and here, for example, is J.P. Morgan's, this is the corner. That's why it's called the corner, it's right there. Okay. In the book, I talk about a bombing that happened on this street in 1920. It was right after this First World War. And you can see Kuhlo moved this office twice, but it's located here and here, very close. Now, there was a way in which I found that if we visualize historical data together, if we looked at where the Morgan partners worked downtown, as well as their syndicate partners, and we contrasted it to where they lived uptown, they worked in a very concentrated area on Wall Street. And I created that earlier map based on a sample of syndicate participants in the Morgan Syndicate books. When I visualized them, these two maps together, their place of work and their place of home, this is when the answer to the question began to take full form. One that was so clearly obvious, it shouldn't have taken me years of mapping and coding and study to discover. And yet it was only through this process that I was able to see so clearly what was there by not being there, what was missing. And in many ways, I think this is what history helps us to do, to see what we take for granted about ourselves and also about the past. The book argues that the key to understanding their relationship was understanding the way in which business was not separate from society, but how they were organized in the context of their society. In other words, the key factor that I discovered in the maps is not that the distance between the homes of the Protestants and the Jews were so far apart, uptown, but the fact that both of their homes were so far away from where they worked. The way that they were able to work together was that they separated their home life from their work life, which gives renewed meaning to the term gentlemen bankers. Because one key difference between where they worked and where they lived was the absence of women in the world downtown. Thus, the answer to how elite private bankers of different ethno-religious backgrounds were able to create trust and work together in the context of anti-Semitism was that their gendered organization of their society allowed them to act as equals and as men in the world of finance to make it seem as if that world was separate from society, even when other evidence, like social clubs, indicated that it was not. Now, it's important to note that women were assumed not to be present in the world of finance, but that does not mean that they were not there at all. They were relegated to different spaces, yes. Out of sight in some cases, yes. But they could also be hiding in plain sight, revealing other significant societal divisions like race. In the book, I talk at greater length about the significance of the figure of Belle de Costa Green van Vliet, also known as Belle Greener, who was Pierpont Morgan's private librarian. Born to an African-American family, Green lived in the center of the domestic world of J.P. Morgan from the early 20th century until her death in 1950. But, and this is the key caveat, she had to pass as a white woman to do so. By her very presence and the conditions in which she lived, the fact that she had to pass as white to belong, Green exposes the gendered and racialized segregation that the world of private bankers assumed and also benefited from. This is not as obvious when we only look at Jews, because despite their severe discrimination, at this time they were still afforded the privileges of whiteness in citizenship, for example, which racialized minorities like Asians and blacks were not. Now, after the publication of Gentlemen Bankers, it became very clear to me what my next project would be. If the segregation of women was so important to the world of private bankers, what happened when women began to be more visible in the world of American finance in the post-Second World War period? What happened when the inclusion of African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans, men and women on Wall Street also became a public, political, and legal issue for the financial community as a whole? In the 1950s, African American companies were not even allowed real estate. I'm sorry about that. Not even allowed real estate on Wall Street. But by 1973, as writer Andrew Tobias wrote in New York Magazine, times were changing, and even the Morgans were, quote, moving to keep up with the changing financial and social environment. At the time, Morgan Guarantee, which is J.P. Morgan's successor bank, had about 1,000 officers, out of which 6, or 0.6%, were African American, and 59, or 6%, were women. Tobias considered these changes to be a sign that, quote, the number of minority employees would be growing in the future like a hot stock. He did note that the number of Jewish employees are harder to come by, but stated that they were also on the rise. In 1986, when the New York Times published an article that declared Wall Street as, quote, no longer a WASP preserve, the larger point it tried to make was that competition and deregulation have been forcing Wall Street banks to become more meritocratic. As evidence, it detailed the biographies of Jewish American bankers who had risen to the top of large banks that had not been founded by Jews. Moreover, the article stated, quote, not only Jews, but other ethnic Americans are now moving into the upper echelons in rising numbers, including second-generation Italian Americans. The caveat, however, is that the article also reported many white ethnic bankers expressed great discomfort with being asked to, quote, discuss the subject in any detail, including, quote, ethnic Americans benefiting from their promotion, Catholic and Jewish. According to the Times, talking about one's ethno-religious background was deemed awkward, and, quote, even those who discussed the issue seemed uncomfortable about it. Most insisted that their names not be used. Those who would talk for the record generally denied that ethnicity, or lack of it, had anything to do with their rise in banking, unquote. Significantly, women and racial minorities did the same. They were reluctant to highlight their gender or race. They were often quoted as saying that they were no different either, a narrative that persists to the present day, with few exceptions. Now, to return to the theme and title of the talk, it is business and it is personal. The point that I'm making is that the persistence of the desire to deny the personal in American finance, to deny the embeddedness of finance in society, is really historically significant. The insistence that the world of business is somehow separate from the world around is reflective of an aspiration. What does this desire, which is presented in story form, tell us about what might be hiding in plain sight? And if it were true, why, as the numbers of women, Asian, Black, and Latino employees grow at banks, why are they still well under this of interviewing? Talk about the barriers to promotion that appear unrelated to their performance. You can see the question starting to form and the way that questions form when evidence collides. The question that has become the topic of my next book on American finance studies the function of this storytelling, the persistence of the idea that business is not personal, to the story of American meritocracy. We might call the myth of American meritocracy. Along the way, as I've shown, with great collaborations with colleagues, with archives, archivists, and libraries, with whom it would not have been possible, interesting, or enjoyable to finish that project. And I want to thank them, and I want to thank all of you for listening today.
Yeah, thank you, Susie. We are opening the platform for question and answers, if there are any.
Thank you, Professor Park, for that. My question is, I want to know, can you tell a little bit about J.P. Morgan's nature?
Yes.
And in the diaries, were there some accounts from everything was maintained or something was not maintained purposely?
Oh, you know, that is a really good question.
And just one second, and if suppose you write a book on politics, you should write this is politics and very, very personal.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things, I did a short interview for a PBS documentary on the Gilded Age where they asked me to talk about him. And one of the things I would say is that he was very self-confident. This really comes off on his papers. So he had kind of a self-assurance about what he thought was his duty and his responsibility and what he was meant to do that really comes across in his writings. He also, excuse me, he was also interested in many things. He had a huge passion for art, for example. He spent a lot of time doing that as well. His son is also Jack Morgan, who was his heir after his death in 1913 until his death in 1943. I think is also a significant Morgan to study, because I don't think he was as passionately, as you can say, about as his father was, because Pierpont Morgan came from a very wealthy family. There was a point at which he could have decided to retire fairly early on. Instead, he decided to continue on in business and do these kind of innovations that led to the billion-dollar corporation of U.S. Steel. The reason why that deal was so innovative, at least in my opinion, and according to other historians, is because it wasn't the idea of the billion-dollar, its valuation was based on future earnings. And so he had these kinds of ideas at that time and was able to actualize them. But he, like Schiff, this was the other thing that was very interesting. Schiff was very similar in terms of his character, in terms of his kind of authority and self-confidence. And this is one of the reasons why in the books, in the correspondence of the bank, even his son, they will refer to him as the senior, with a capital S. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for the very fascinating talk. I was wondering what sort of relationship the Italian-American banking community had with both the Anglo-American bankers and the Jewish-American bankers.
That's a great question. Probably the most famous Italian-American banker was a commercial banker named A.P. Giannini, who founded the Bank of America in California. And I think, like many Catholic bankers, they were kind of on the outside. I don't think there's another slideshow that I had where I show pictures of Otto Kahn and his daughter, with the daughter of a Catholic lawyer. And there's an interesting way, actually, that Catholic elites who converted to Episcopalianism and Jewish elites who also converted actually were socially close and did intermarry. So Otto Kahn, who was one of the Jewish bankers, his daughter Margaret Kahn, married the grandson of a very well-known Catholic financier, but by that time both had converted to Episcopalianism. And so you do see cases. There was a book written by Stephen Birmingham called, I believe it's called Real Lace. Could be mistaking the title. That was about Catholic elites in New York, and so they were there. But in terms of banking, I'm trying to think of the best known are probably the commercial bankers that came from California, where there was more kind of like a pioneer opportunity than the East Coast establishment.
I just want to shift the discussion into a slightly different subject with your permission. You explored in great detail in the talk, as also in the things you've written, this problem of ethnic discord between Jewish bankers and American Protestant bankers. Now clearly it is quite self-evident that this discord did not impact adversely the overall functioning of American capitalism.
Yes.
And the growth, the enormous growth of the American economy at this time. It also did not impact the manner in which America dealt with the world. Now, what sort of processes are also on at this time which ensure that this discord between two sections of American elites does not go out of hand and wreak havoc with society as it can?
Right.
For instance, more specifically, what role did the American state play in ensuring that it did not get out of hand? Now, when I'm mentioning this, I cannot but mention the situation in India today. We have ethnic discord, which is actually being encouraged by those who rule this country. And I think everyone in this room will agree that it can wreak havoc to the economy as it is already. So I just wanted your...
Thank you for the comment. You know, while you were talking, I was thinking that I think you could make the argument that American capitalism would have developed differently without the presence of racism, given the amount of collateral damage and just waste that racism represents. I mean, think of the waste in terms of human intellect and power that you suffer because you have discriminatory education, and legislative policies for immigration, not allowing people to rise to their best resources. So actually, as you were talking, I think that you could say that there, it has affected it quite negatively if you want to think of it from that perspective. I completely agree with you. I think that the U.S. state played an enormous role in maintaining the power of the elites. Because one thing that Krumlov and JP Morgan had in common is that they were kind of the top bank in their era. So they were within a class-based context, right, where they're the elites in that context. And so you could argue that there's one thing that I argue in the book where the state did allow them to have the position that they did, which is that they would not interfere with their freedom of association. So there was a case, for example, when Henry Davison, who was one of the partners, was asked about colluding with other bankers and on the stand. And the prosecutor says to him, "What about this meeting that you have every Tuesday at the Metropolitan Club?" Right? He was like, "I don't have meetings at the Metropolitan Club." Right? So you're just meeting with your friends. Right? These aren't meetings. Right? There's no business done at the club. That kind of thing. Right? And you couldn't interfere with that. You could make people drop off interlocking boards. But then one of the things that we actually studied is, were you more likely to drop off boards if you had other ways of communicating with those same people? And so there was a letter that I found in James Stillman's papers at Columbia Butler Library. He was the former head of the National City Bank, which also combined with First National Bank to become Citibank. And Frank Vanderleep, who was the current head of Citibank at the time, is writing him and saying, and they had a meeting actually with the Morgans and said, "We don't need boards to talk to our friends." Right? So the way that the government was organized, they were not going to interfere with that. And that's actually one of the conclusions of Gentlemen Bankers. By 1940, JP Morgan and Company becomes a corporation. They're no longer a private partnership. And they realized that they could do that because now they had the support of the state. They could raise capital elsewhere, outside of their own private capital, but that the state was not going to interfere in how they did their business. That was one thing. But I do think there is something to be said about how the organization of American politics affords elites a certain position that protects them from class conflict. Yeah, and there's much more that can be said about that, but thank you. It's a wonderful question.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you very much for your fascinating lecture. My question is, could you shed any light on the philanthropic activities if they were undertaken by JP Morgan? And also, how do you look at the changing face of business, this transformation over the years? That's my question, ma'am.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
It's so interesting that you say philanthropy. I know that probably Morgan scholars would disagree with me, but I'm not sure that I would consider him a philanthropist in the same way as, for example, Jacob Schiff. Right? Jacob Schiff founded the Montefiore House for people who had tuberculosis. There was an interesting story there because it was open to people of any background. It was not limited to Jewish people. And he really took offense when people asked him if it was only open to Jews. Morgan was very interested in things like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the American Museum of Natural History, and to the extent that even when I go there today and kind of marvel at these public institutions, I think they really bring a lot to our city. But in terms of like charity work, it has been some time, but honestly nothing is kind of like popping out at me that I can think of. Regarding your question on the changing face of Wall Street, I really have to recommend this wonderful book by Angel Pollock Fallen, which is called Engendering Business. And she just doesn't look at banks. She does look at financial services like insurance, but she looks at all corporations exactly in this period in the early 20th century. And one of the things she's looking at is when women start to move more into the world, into the corporate world, and how corporations accommodated for them. And one of the things that she found is that they just bring the gender norms that existed in society within to the firm. So the way that women dressed, their spaces, their roles, was all incorporated to not disturb those traditions and norms that existed outside in the workings of the business. It's really interesting. If she had done that for post-1960 finance, I wouldn't have to write my book, honestly. You know, because as historians, we don't want to redo something that is unnecessary. So I often talk about how painful it is to do research. It was very painful to translate those syndicate books. And at a certain point, I was really like, how can we do this through artificial intelligence so that we don't have to do this? But it's impossible because rich, wealthy people tend to name their children after themselves. And the only way you can distinguish who they are is by tracking their wives and their children. So it's so painful. So it's impossible not to do it by hand. So if somebody else has done it, I'd be like, that's wonderful, I can go do other projects. But I highly recommend this one. Yes, it's a really, really good book.
You mentioned institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art that he set up. Did JP Morgan have a role in setting up the Federal Reserve and Harvard Business School and both these things? And what motivated him to do that? And in passing, you mentioned that they decided not to talk about FDR's election. What did they do later on?
So about the Federal Reserve, Morgan died in 13, and so people have argued in the literature that he had an indirect impetus on the founding of the Reserve because in the Panic of 1907 that he displayed so much authority and power that people came to him. There's a wonderful paper written by Eric Hill, who's a professor at Wellesley in the economics department, and Carola Friedman, about Morgan's role in the Panic of 1907 and all of the different trust companies. People were very disturbed that one person could have all this influence because there was no central bank in the United States like there is, for example, for the Bank of England. And so people credit that with starting there had been obviously a central bank before in the United States, but it was killed by Andrew Jackson. So it's not that we had no experience with it, but that conversation starts to unfold. Also, this is in the period what's called the Progressive Era, where there is a movement, basically a social movement of many different kinds of people to bring experts and kind of efficiency into American society and politics. So in terms of people who were actually probably in the room, actually Kuhn Loeb's former partner Paul Warburg. So Felix Warburg, who came from a very well-known Hamburg banking family. Their family firm was called M&M Warburg, and his brother both married into the Kuhn Loeb family. And then Paul, who was really much more of an intellectual, left. Felix is actually much more of a philanthropist. His papers very clear with like Jewish relief and so on. Paul was very instrumental in the founding of the Federal Reserve. In terms of the FDR election, the Morgans are very funny because they really, one, they hated publicity, all right? So you can tell even from their bank, there's no sign that says JP Morgan. I mean, I wonder what he thinks if he walks around and sees like JP Morgan Chase everywhere, you know? There was none of that. It was very discreet, right? That was part of your reputation. You were not flashy or showy. And so they really did not comment on politics. They did not want to get, but privately, obviously, they really did not like FDR or the New Deal or the Democratic Party. But both the Kuhn Loeb and the Morgan banks were staunch Republicans, yes, politically.
Thank you so much, Professor Park, for bringing together social and business history. My question and sort of thought really build upon what the gentleman earlier spoke about, and how do figures like Belle Green and women in the family figure among this kind of social questions of discrimination and inequality. And I'd like you to build upon a word that you used, and another historian, Charles Peterson, works on the question of meritocracy. So if you could expand a little bit on the question of meritocracy and how do figures like Belle Green come up. Thank you.
Yeah, the figure of Belle Green is so interesting. So for those of you who don't know, next year the Morgan Library is actually going to do a big exhibit on her. And I'm very curious to see what it's going to say. Because when you go to the Morgan bookshop now, they have little pins with her face on it, and they talk about how she was the Morgan's first black librarian. But I was like, but she was passing the entire time. She was there. And she left in 1949. She never declared herself, right, as African American. Now, she came actually from a very prominent African American family. Her father, Richard T. Greener, was the first black man to graduate from Harvard with an undergraduate degree. He was actually in the Department of State at Vladivostok in Russia under the Theodore Roosevelt's administration. Her personal story, which really fascinates people. I think there are 2 fiction books that have come out about her. I bet you a movie's going to come out about her soon, there was a monograph about her, a nonfiction monograph by Heidi Arzioni. It also came out about her. But to me, the most significant thing about her, and they like to talk about how she was able to live her life, and she was quite important to his art collecting, and she became an important figure in the art collecting world. She destroyed her papers, so we don't know what she said, except for the letters that she sent a man named Bernard Beretson, who was her lover in Florence. So that's how we have some idea of her correspondence. I've also seen her correspondence in the Morgan Library when she's talking to J.P. Morgan. And there's this question, for example, whether or not he actually knew she was black, but they were just like wink, wink, And I'm like, there is no indication to me that he knew that she was black. And they had this kind of understanding. In fact, in a footnote, there's a letter that she wrote to him very soon before he died, where she's kind of talking about how distressed she is to hear that he was ill. And she was very, personally close to him. And she had kind of like I said, that sentimentality to him in her letters. And she's telling him some gossip about how a woman named Agnes Meyer had given birth to a baby. And she was glad that someone was carrying on the race as long as it wasn't her. Now, if Agnes Meyer had been black, we would have something to say. So I had to track down who Agnes Meyer was. And if it was this woman who I thought it was, if she had had a baby the week before, or 2 weeks before this letter had been written. And I am almost positive that Agnes Meyer refers to the wife of Ernest Meyer, who was a financier, one of whose daughters was Katharine Graham, who became the publisher of the Washington Post. And she is a white woman, right? She was like German Lutheran. So, these are just like clues, right? We don't really know. But nothing about his world ever said to me that they would have accepted somebody who was black in their midst, either domestically or at work, at that level, right? That isn't to say there weren't African Americans on Wall Street as runners or something like that, right? So what more interesting to me is the same question about the meritocracy story. Why is it so important to say that it's a meritocracy? Why is it so important to say that it's a meritocracy then? You could say that you want it to be a meritocracy today, right? That's perfectly legitimate. But to say, in contrast to so much evidence that it was a meritocracy then, is a totally different thing, right? It says something about us and our desire to see the past in a certain way. It's not about the past, really. It's much more about us, right? It's like why I often say that history is a mirror. History is a mirror to us, right? And so this desire to see her as a race pioneer, she was not in the NAACP. She was not like Ida B. Wells. She wasn't even like Walter White, who was so white that he passed on trains in the segregated South to investigate the segregation, right? So to me, she is very significant as someone who reveals Morgan's racism. But that's not very, you can't put that on a banner necessarily in front of a library. But as a historian, that's the most interesting thing. And why can we not say that today? Because that was literally 100 years ago, right? He died in 1913. So that's so interesting to me. It's not about the past, it's really about the present. And I really don't know how they're going to handle it. I have talked to people and said, how are you going to talk about the context of racism? Or are you going to decontextualize her to the point where you just celebrate her as a figure? To me, kudos to Belle Green, the historic figure, right? But it's not the whole story of the Morgan Bank or of Wall Street, frankly. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
It's also to do with the sense of political correctness that we seem to be imbued today with. Also sometimes blindsiding some of these things.
Yeah, well, I would say it's more a desire to avoid accountability for white supremacy.
Okay.
That we want to say that all those things happened in the past, but we don't want to talk about how they kind of blend into the future. In the same way that the book that I recommended talked about how there was a time where at the Morgan Bank, women were not allowed in the bank. And one of the partners who had come from New York Life Insurance Company had a secretary, because in insurance it was more common earlier, actually in the late 19th century. And he was not allowed to bring her into the bank building. He had to hire an office for her in the Equitable building down the street, meet with her, and then come to the bank, right? And so the only time women were allowed in the bank was on New Year's Day when the bank was closed, and then the wives would come for lunch. Right? So this was in the early part of the 20th century, in the late 19th century. Then there comes a time when women start to work in the bank. But they're working in specific places, they have specific dress, and so it's all incorporated. So from a historian's perspective, there's a continuum. Same thing with the study of whiteness. But then there comes a point where people are like, well, we don't want to talk about those things. Again, that's about us, right? And to me, it's a question of why? Why can't we talk about the past? We didn't do that. That was then, right? So I'm still trying to figure that out, actually. Why? If you have ideas, please tell me. Why can't we talk about things that we didn't do? As if we did them. Because then we actually act as though we did them, even though we didn't do them, right? So it's so interesting.
It's also something about shaming that happens,
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a way in which I think, certainly in the United States, I would argue this, we're not taught enough how to apologize. There's a wonderful quote by a black feminist named Audre Lorde. And one of the things that she says, I gave this in a lecture recently, is that nothing that I admit about myself to myself can be used to diminish me. Right? So you make mistakes, you can apologize. Right? You can say you're sorry, you were wrong. And you have to do it very quickly, like after the fact. I feel like we have to train to do that, actually. We're not always trained, even in schools, to do that, which is a shame. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Professor Park, that was a wonderful lecture. What I wanted to know, I don't think you touched upon it, was the international banking scenario. With JP Morgan and Godrej. You talked about the projects that were being done in the US. What were the connections overseas, especially with the City of London, and then with other port cities, colonial port cities, where most of these banks had a presence?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. So, the Morgans and Godrej were the bankers that they were. They had the stature that they did in the United States because they were international bankers. Absolutely, that's the context, right? That the capital was abroad, and what they were doing, they were basically the conduits for international capital into American projects, into infrastructure, at a time where the United States had very little capital, right? And so that was where their influence came from. And Godrej was basically channeling both their German but also British contacts into the U.S. And JP Morgan actually started as as an American bank based in London. So that was the first iteration actually of the bank. It was started by Pierpont Morgan's father, Junius. He had been asked by another American banker named George Peabody, who was originally from Baltimore, to come over as a partner in the mid 19th century. And so international merchant bankers, their original source of underwriting really had to do with trade. You know, they come from this kind of very ancient, going back to the medieval era in Italy, tradition of merchant traders. And so there's not as much of that in the book because it's really focused on the American side. But certainly the international context has been covered in much greater detail by other historians. The European side, I mean, like for example, there's a wonderful paper by Emily Erickson and Peter Behrman that looks at trading networks and the East India Company that I refer to really for much more for their understanding of networks and why diverse networks can be more profit-making, I guess you could say, than other. It's called, I'll have to find the title for you. But in terms of the international finance side, we've covered much more in the dissertation, but there's one chapter that talks about their financing of Japan. And this was one of the things that they unfortunately had in common, is that they both assisted Japan in expanding its empire in China, particularly in Manchuria. So one of the loans that the Morgans underwrote was the South Manchurian Railway loan in 1927. And this was very controversial because it expanded the Japanese presence in Manchuria, and then later on Manchuria became critical.
With Chiang Kai-shek rather than the communists who overthrew him. Was that also a factor?
You know, that's really interesting. I did not find much interaction between specifically Chiang Kai-shek or Madame Chiang Kai-shek with the Morgans, but certainly at a certain point, because basically the Morgans had participated in a loan for the Hupong Railway in 1909, and because China was in such chaos in this period, in this interwar period, after the end of the Qing dynasty and the warlord period, because of European imperial presence, right, that eventually they default on the loan. And they stopped paying the loan. And there's still coupons around. I think in the 80s somebody tried to present them to China to get them to pay it back, right? That kind of thing. And so the Morgans used that, Thomas Lamont in particular, one of the senior partners, as a pretext to say we can't lend money to China as a result because you defaulted on this loan, and until you pay this loan back, we're not going to give you any money. And instead, on the other hand, they're lending money to Japan. Does that make sense? So in this way, the IDC actually undermined Chinese sovereignty and kind of pushed them more in the arena of Japan. Yes?
Thank you.
Hello. I think we'll end the question and answer round. Okay, fine. We'll have one last question.
My question will look strange to you, but perhaps it will start another research project for you. What was his date of birth?
I believe Morgan Sr. was born in the 1830s, and his son was born, I think, in 1867.
Tell me the date of birth.
Date.
April 17th.
When he was born?
Yeah.
J.P. Morgan?
April 17th as per Google.
I believe when he died, he was in his 70s, and he died in 1913, so I believe he was born in
75 as per Google.
He was 75 when he died.
Right. Okay. So I believe he was born in 1837, around there?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm not interested in the year, I'm interested in the date of birth. Month and date.
Oh,
It's there on Google.
I don't actually remember the month, but I believe he died in April. For some reason, I remember the death more than the birth. I don't know what that says about him.
It says April 17th as per Google.
April 17th, he was born?
Yes.
Is this significant to you, the month and the day?
Sorry?
Is it significant to you, the month and the day?
Yes, because we're trying to find out whether his attitudes are guided by environmental trends.
Okay. So actually, you were asking me if he was interested in astrology.
Yeah, yeah.
And we do know that Morgan was a member of it was kind of like a secret society called the Zodiac Club. Yes, but because it was secret, it's kind of difficult to find out exactly what was happening.
Maybe he was guided by the planet Pluto.
I could not the best person to ask that question would be Gene Strauss, who wrote a biography of Morgan, Sr., that I cite in the book, called Morgan, American Financier. But she goes much more deeply into his biographical details about him as a person.
Yes.
So will we have to look up Google for this?
No, you have to meet a street astrologer.
I think we can continue the discussion after the question. Is there anybody else?
Thank you for the lecture. I think I was more wondering about your next project as such. When women are discriminated, were there more friendships because they were women, as men could differentiate between their social and financial? Was Belle Green and someone like a Jewish friend was much more easier when they are women because they were discriminated on the basis of being women?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's a wonderful question. You know, in terms of my research, I couldn't answer that question now, but there is a book by Melissa Fisher, who's an anthropologist, called Wall Street Women, where she mostly talks about white women on Wall Street, where I think you find both very different. And then maybe
Thank you so much, Susie. This was a superbly insightful lecture. I'm sure everybody here agrees. Yeah, very fascinating. I mean, there was definitely the social nature of business that you brought out as promised. But what was most delightful for us basically outlined the worth of archives in unfolding so many layers of business and history. So thank you so much for that. And I'd like to thank a few more people before we wind up for the evening. A very, very big thank you to Dr. Firoza Godrej and all the other Godrej family members who are constantly here to always inspire and guide and support us. To Mr. Anil Verma, who is Executive Director and CEO of Godrej Boys, and Ms. Harpreet Kaur, Senior Vice President and Head Corporate P&A. A big thank you to the RBYC. So to Mrs. Bakchi and all the RBYC staff who worked as hard as all of us to make this all a success. Thanks to Harsha, who's clicking all those wonderful pictures, and his team, Vicky, Chirag and Ishwar, for being there to capture all these moments, the photos, the videos. All of them will go into the archive and be there available for reference and research. This lecture is super special for us because it's the first one happening after the pandemic, the first in-person lecture happening after the pandemic. So there are lots of thoughts running through our heads since morning. You know, there could be a million things that could go wrong, but all those fears were laid to rest when you guys turned up in such numbers. And to hear Susie speak and to support us, and of course all those wonderful potent questions that made that discussion very interesting. Also to all those people who joined us online. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. So thank you so much everyone in the audience. Have a lovely evening everyone.